Hey folks, welcome back to the channel. Today we are journeying back through the past of Total War's history and celebrating one of the greats, Total War Three Kingdoms, which launched back in 2019. And I'm joined by some of the greats who are here to tell you more about that story. Mo, why don't you start us off? Tell us about who you are and what you did on the project.
Hello, I'm Morag. I am a lead tech artist now. On the project, I think I was a senior tech artist.
And then to my right we have Janos.
Hey, I'm Janos. I was the game director of Three Kingdoms, and right now I'm the head of product for Total War.
And finally Pav.
Hi, I'm Pavel, and I was the art director on Three Kingdoms, and now I'm a game director on the Total War team.
Okay, well, Total War's history is very much rooted in the foundations of games like Shogun, which started out in the East, and then we moved on to games like Medieval and Rome later on. But Three Kingdoms was a return to us to this setting, but this time looking at China. How is it that we came to pick this as one of our settings?
Well, it's a long story. In my childhood, I was always fascinated with China and Chinese culture, Chinese history. I really liked Hong Kong cinema and a lot of the Kung Fu movies and contemporary writers, but joining CA and making a couple of the games, I found some like-minded people. And one evening, while the rest of the team was out in a research trip, finding out that what we should make, what different game idea could come, we sat down and watched Red Cliff. And while we were watching Red Cliff, it was all the way through that this is Total War. This is absolutely Total War. We should totally make it. Everyone was like, yeah, it totally makes sense. So I guess it was a big surprise for...
Yeah, so me and about 5 others were on a research trip out of the country, researching another idea that we were planning to go into early concepting with. And we come back and we were making Three Kingdoms. So that was a fun surprise.
Now, making games, it's never easy, especially when a game has such a grand scale and vision that a Total War is going to have. It encompasses so much of the strategy genre. When you think back on your time working on it as developers, what are some of those standout challenges and tough things that you had to say, well, we have this vision, but it's going to be hard to get there? What are the things you had to overcome to do that?
Well, I think that that there are always a lot. As you say that games are not easy to make, I think that's an understatement. And if you think about team sizes, we are thinking about 50 to 100 creatives working together. Everyone has their own ideas, own interpretation of not just the vision, but the world and their own dreams and hopes and all of this. And for me, it's usually the biggest is it synchronizing and aligning all of these to make sure that the whole team, everyone from artist to programmer, speaks the same language and working towards the same goal.
Absolutely, yeah. That kind of alignment, seeking that alignment and buy-in from the wider team is super crucial. Making sure that everyone's kind of singing from the same hymn sheet. And in particular, it's a challenge when we tackle a topic that's kind of less familiar. So a different culture, different setting, different country. With China, there's a lot more kind of work to get that buy-in and connection to the content because it's not as inherently familiar as some of the more traditional kind of titles had been. So that's definitely a challenge. But here, I mean, the book was a great in on that kind of buy-in. But obviously the Romance of the Three Kingdoms. But there were a lot of challenges. Specific challenges to the content that we can absolutely get into as well if we have the time. But yeah, from everything from the 2D character portraits to the visual style, the character interactions, all of that kind of stuff, trying to represent the building tech. Yeah, I mean, this was it was a very challenging production for sure.
Talk to us about the building tech, Mo. That sounds like trauma. Let's get it out.
What a good trauma.
Yeah. I mean, I love that every Total War, technology-wise, we're always trying to do something different, make things better, for the people making the content, as well as to make the game more interesting, right? And yeah, the building tech was something. Before this, we'd sort of been making buildings as like one singular mesh and sort of popping that in the map and stuff. But because we wanted to sort of be able to swap buildings a bit better and build up buildings differently, we wanted to build them up as what we call kit pieces. So that was, rather than building an entire building as a mesh, you'd build like wall parts and roof parts, and then you could make any sort of shape building with those pieces in mind. So our graphics team and tools team and lots of teams sort of worked together to sort of try and make that work with our engine. And there was, a lot of struggle in the meantime of like, okay, well now instead of one mesh, we've got like 50, and whether that works for performance and stuff like that. But
lots of fancy merging of meshes on
yes,
load, and,
yeah.
and on top of that, we had the slot system where we wanted to connect the campaign and battle more. You know, we always try and seek this campaign and battle connection to really connect the two. So we had, you know, the buildings that you would build on a campaign map, you could see on the battlefield, damage them, and that damage would feed back. And just making sure that those things are connected and working alongside all of the kits and pieces, definitely a challenge.
And presumably this is still tech we use today.
Yeah, I think like it's like a step that then we can take forward to other games.
We learn from those mistakes, throw out all the stuff that was a nightmare, and try and build on, you know, try and refine and you know, it's and do something that based on that experience that kind of can function better.
Yeah, and this especially as 3K was very, you could say, art. The whole vision was very art driven as well. There were a lot of collaboration with different artists, more than Sudan in I think any other Total War game, because the gameplay, like if you think about the technology tree with the branches, with the that is represented as an actual tree, the design and the art had to work very closely together, and with the tech art of making sure that the ink is flowing in the right way. And we can talk a lot about that, like how big challenge was that from a tech art point of view to actually make a system from this very chaotic nature of an ink, but ultimately the results speak for themselves.
Yeah, you were saying that, you reminded me earlier that the artist had recorded like dropping ink into water as reference, and yeah, there was lots of really beautiful.
Yeah, we still have the scrolls upstairs somewhere.
Yeah.
But we got a bunch of, you know, paper, ink, and we were doing all kinds of brush strokes, recording different quantities and viscosity of ink to water to try and nail that kind of flowing yet solid kind of shape.
Yeah, yeah.
Sometimes
it was the first time that I think we'd used like what we call custom shaders with UI as well, right? So we'd I think it was for Warhammer 1 or 2, we'd started using, the graphics team had given us like a node-based system for creating shaders, because before then it was all in HLSL, and the graphics team kind of looked after shaders. And when they sort of gave us this system, it sort of opened up to tech art teams and beyond. So we could start sort of working on shaders from our side too. And we'd started working on that mostly for shaders in the 3D viewport, but not necessarily for UI. So that was a new thing. But yeah, we used like lovely technique called flow maps, where it just sort of like you give it directions and you tell it where to sort of push this ink texture, and it made it look really flowy.
It's such an extraordinary roster of characters that we have in the game. When you're reflecting back on your time developing it, and when you're thinking about how you've since gone on to play the game after that, who are the characters that stand out to you as being, these were the real fun ones to make and play with?
My favourite character to play as after a while, I think, became Kong Ron, because you could play tall. You could essentially try and play the campaign without really fighting battles. It was kind of really something that we tried to do for a while. And that's, I think, the closest we ever got to with a historical title, where you could try and engineer your way.
A diplomatic victory there. Where you can
absolutely. So that was really interesting. I like that. And then obviously playing with Liu Bei and Guan Yu, the god of war. I think probably my favorite characters.
Yeah, character-wise, I really like Zhuge Liang, because obviously he invented everything. We can thank the different dumplings to him, and the repeating crossbow. And Cao Cao is very like conflicting and very colorful individual, and he's definitely not the good guy in the romance series, but
But he's not the bad guy, right?
He's not.
That's
He's
the
very
magic.
Machiavellian, and but the most interesting and from development point of view, my most loved one is Liu Bei, because when we're developing Liu Bei, I came up with a new idea of like method design, like similar to the method acting, because Liu Bei is someone who is really loved by everyone. He is basically the leader of people, and we started to go by the classic design principle of like, okay, let's make everyone super happy with him, and wherever you go, people are just cheering at you. But what we found is basically it made all the players not caring about people at all, because they love you. You don't need to basically care about them. So it was just absolutely clashing the fantasy with the implementation and the gameplay. So we turned it around and wanted to figure out ways where the player has a internal like drive to try to please people and make people happy. So we turned around this whole system into something where you get bonuses if you have more happy people. So it makes Liu Bei play in a way that like you try to make people happy, because that's good for you. And suddenly everything clicked together, and then we rolled out the similar, you could say, this method design to the rest of the cast, and I think it's part of why 3K became that like a special one.
Really interesting thing as well with the characters, just thinking back now, is kind of balancing them in a way that wouldn't upset the romance. So you've got these Lu Bu, how can you know, the ultimate warrior, obviously cannot be beaten by some random upstart, you know, in dual combat. So making sure that the interplay of these characters, Guan Yu, you know, you have these impossible matchups because it's a sandbox. You could have characters matching up in the game that wouldn't match up, you know, didn't match up in a novel. So making sure that the fantasy was there and the right balance was there, depending, and then the characters basically could live up to their fantasy and image in these impossible matchups. That was definitely a fun challenge.
The art style in Total War 3 Kingdoms, I mean, this sits unrivaled as far as I'm concerned in the pantheon of Total War games as some of the best we've ever done. Where did that inspiration come from?
I mean, it's always a team effort. Janos had lots of input as well, and we had a fantastic lead concept artist, Lulu, as well, that kind of brought it all together. But really, it all started with China. Surprisingly enough, it's just such an incredible source of inspiration. And at the very beginning, the really early days, we when we were doing kind of research, and we've already touched on this a little bit, where we try and take that kind of present, current, more modern approach to the content that we're trying to present. The first thing we researched were kind of modern Chinese artists. And two in particular really stood out to me. One was Wu Guanzhou, and the other one was Chang Dai-chen. And they were basically, both of them had very, very striking, very unique, at least to me, to my eyes, kind of styles. The first had this kind of predominantly white kind of background imagery with these, you know, splashes of limited color and black, kind of really, you know, beautifully minimalist but kind of expressive. And the other used these you know, really deep and rich splashes of color, turquoise and jade. And both of these were almost like our primary visual references to everything that we did. They inspired the kind of early campaign concepts, the shroud, the even the, you know, the front end, kind of animated front end sequence that maybe a bit of additional scope. We did put that together very late day towards the end of the project, was kind of an amalgamation of those two inspirations. So that's really where it started. And we obviously wanted to also you know, pay an homage to kind of Chinese cinema, you know, all of those really visually striking movies that we were kind of watching as visual references alongside Red Cliff. You know, Hero comes to mind, Crouching Tiger and a Dragon, these really striking.
Yeah, I think
the use of color in those was so inspirational.
Yeah, and even Romance of the Three Kingdoms as a novel, the interesting, you could say, the narrative is about like, here are these big warlords and big characters, and they are all fighting against the fate. So they go and they try to do something that is basically fighting against their own destiny. But ultimately they arrive where they have to arrive. So everything is a bit ephemeral and a bit like transient, and that was basically I think that like inspired a lot Pev into looking these modern, more like minimalistic, sometimes very ethereal art pieces to
Ethereal,
represent this
yeah.
this like impermanence of things.
Ethereal was a word we used a lot.
Yeah.
And I think, and there's the physical representation of the world as well, which I think something that I was quite surprised at and quite vocal about during development. A lot of other games we looked at that depicted China kind of really did not do justice to the incredible biodiversity, natural diversity that China has. You know, so many climates, so many biomes, so many striking geographical and geological kind of, you know, such a striking tapestry from the Yellow Mountains, you know, down to, you know, just incredible kind of, yeah, diversity there. So we really wanted to bring that to life and really celebrate the distinct geographical kind of characteristics of China, and by having them, you know, on the campaign map and then also represented in the battle to really kind of bring it to life, because it's incredible.
And yeah, it's almost like make them into realistic but still very artistic paintings, so you can immerse yourself. It's almost like the best that you can get out of like nature experiences. You are out in the world, and that unique 1,000 like sunrise where you feel that you are in a painting, and that's something that we wanted to really recreate and make the whole game out of that, like 1 of 1,000, which is not a small ask.
That campaign map was like beautiful. It was so luscious, like the vegetation felt really great, and yeah, those geographical features. The water as well, like having that sort of like, yeah, the water changed. It wasn't just sort of blue everywhere. There was some really fun features in there where like, yeah, you could sort of map out everything from like the colour map of the water.
Yeah, for sure. And we had some, I mean, you touched on it earlier, we had some really nice kind of tech advancements at this time as well, because you had the you know, the node-based kind of shader editing, which helped us do a lot. And then we had some, you know, nice tech coming in, like the shadow casting and fog. And so we could do some really striking. The day-night cycle came in to play, so we could have that kind of this living campaign with the day-night cycle, which was really striking. And again, playing on that the inspiration from the cinema, from other sources, you know, playing with the color, we could really kind of push the palette as well. Have really ridiculously blue night battles to contrast with the burning fire of the fire arrows, and you know, really have that kind of you know, spectacle. Really, I think it all just kind of came together. And,
yeah, that's the same with the audio as well. That like I think the audio team did a fantastic job to bring it alive. That I remember that like had to go like at least 10 different rounds and iteration around just the cicadas, because you have a very specific cicada sound in the Japanese anime movies, which I absolutely love, but the Chinese is not exactly the same, and we wanted to make sure that it's authentic. And during the summer season, you get that like the muggy weather and this feeling of what it would invoke. And I think Richard Beddoe did a fantastic job with the soundtrack as well. Got all authentic instruments, and we got in like one of the famous like ergo player to make sure that like we get everything right.
Yeah, it was a lot of getting things right. I just sorry, I don't know why. I think the cicadas made me think back to some of the battle work and the amount of times we tried to, you know, one of the biggest challenges on Battle Axe is just to get the rice terraces. Yeah, we had like, you know, the terrain resolution was like 1 vert per 2 meters. So to try to get any kind of terracing was.
And the water flowing with the water wheel.
And the water, the amount of hours I spent just massaging terraces so they actually looked nice and immersive and kind of, you know, and the little touches like the little temples on top of mountains and yeah, the water wheel, a little animated bamboo water wheel just to get some life into the world. Yeah, it was a lot of.
Yeah, and we had it. Like, actually, it's combination work on the lighting side, because we use like very subtle LUTs to make sure that basically the characters are standing out and we tell a slightly different story. Potentially most of the people wouldn't even recognize that, like, unless you turn it off, but characters have slightly different shading and the soldiers have slightly different shading. And
yeah, again, some of the new tech, we were able to do different post-processing based on characters. Different. We could identify different units, different entities, and color them differently based on that, which was kind of fun. That's what.
But just super small. Just that, like, if you look the after and before, you see it and you say that, like, yeah, this is needed. But if you look at it, you can't see it.
But there's a lot of these little things come in to build up the whole, right? Tiny little steps that kind of form the bigger picture. Yeah.
Now, whenever 3K comes up in conversation, our players, they've got a hit list of things they love to talk about when it comes to this, whether it is the gorgeous campaign map, as we mentioned earlier on, whether it's the battles and the ability for the generals to duel against each other. But diplomacy, it's pretty much always top of those charts in terms of things that players really love about what this game brought to Total War. Was that always one of those gold standard things that we wanted to get right with this game? Or was it something that we just discovered along the way and ended up creating something super special?
Well, I think that, like, we have our own hit list and we always want to get right a couple of things to make sure that we build like a better, you could say, grand strategy game where you have the civic and the military sides completely intertwining, and trade is usually on the hit list, and like economy is on the hit list, but diplomacy is super important. And we discuss it a lot of time, different approaches, and Three Kingdoms era is a lot about basically different dealings between each other and making sure that, like, that personal level and all those aspects and the I give, you give is working well. So, for example, the reverse deal making, where previously it always felt a bit that you go there and you just keep nagging someone that, like, would you accept this? How about 10 gold? How about 15 gold? How about 16, 17? And it felt that, like, it just simply, it takes away some of the fantasy behind diplomacy. So that's why we were adding elements on the fly that, like, what would make this work, or okay, I start from not I'm interacting with someone, but from the other side.
So the reputation came in, reputation loss and gain, that kind of gave that character, it's not just, you're not just dealing with kind of state entities, it's more like, you're dealing with an individual character. You have a history with that character, potentially, you have a relationship with that character. Maybe you've never met, maybe you have, maybe that character was once in your enemy's faction now, but they have, an opinion of you, and that kind of influences that whole interplay. But like Janusz says, there's always a lot to choose from. We have the benefit, the gift and maybe the curse of being, a long lasting series of games. So we have a long history of features, different balance of features, different kind of combinations of features, that we can pull out and utilize on every new kind of project that we work on. And it's a case of saying, okay, what have we done in the past? What do we want to take forward? What's the most applicable to this particular title at this time? Does it need to be rewritten? Do we need to reassess because of the context of the setting? And all of these things always play a part in when we in the early concepting and pre-production phase. What fits, what doesn't? Which thing is really appropriate here? Family trees, for example, is it really appropriate? Is it maybe less so because of the timeline? These are the things the choices that we have to make. We can't do it all, unfortunately, as much as we'd love to.
Yeah, that's always the biggest issue, that, like, we have all the ideas and all the ideas that would fit the game, but we have to make a priority that, like, what overall tells the most coherent and the best story that we want to give to the players.
Yeah, and diplomacy came up as one of the most important things that we need to tackle here.
I always feel really bad when I'm talking to people in the office about the feature, if they worked on it, because I'm the player who just sits there and says, sorry, no, I'm pressing refuse on that offer. You can become my vassal. And there's not a lot of diplomacy in my campaigns, I won't lie. Other gameplay changes we made in this iteration of Total War, a change that kind of takes its effect most on the battlefield, but retinues. This is a pretty big shift for us for Total War. We've switched to the system whereby now we are sort of limiting how many units that a particular general might pick up within their army. Talk to us about where that kind of decision came from. Was that inspired very much by the setting and wanting to be somewhat accurate or evoking a feeling of what our setting was, or was this something that gameplay-wise we'd learned about from previous Total War games?
Well, I think Retinue is something that was always, you could say, a double-edged sword. It's not directly inspired by China or by the book, but we always wanted to play a bit more with army organization. That usually, if you're thinking about like history or just the reality, individual like units are not moving by themselves. There is always an organization to an army. When you have like a couple of hundred people just by themselves, is more a raiding party, but it's not an army, and it's not state level. And Total War is always about state level. It's the highest level. We are not about like small skirmishes. So army organization is very important. And when we started to talk about retinues, it wasn't even at the start of Three Kingdoms. It was a bit earlier, and we're talking about just overall how can we add some army organization method that would work across history and across Total War games in any era. And because with Three Kingdoms era we are talking about a quasi-feudalistic system, it absolutely made sense that like the units are coming with people. You are not just getting like 200 people, but there is a hierarchy of like how the army is built up, and it was like the right place to try it with the focus on the characters, with basically the army organization nature of it, making sure that your thinking is a bit on the state level, reinforcing that. So yeah, that was you could say the inspiration.
And it just clicked, didn't it? Because we had under everything we had the Wujing, the 5 elements, and you had the characters that were of an element, water, fire, or metal, and then different units had elemental skews as well. So there were bonuses, and there was interplay between the retinue and the kind of character they were attached to. So you can kind of play around with that kind of army building, retinue building, essentially to play around with the benefits of the Wujing that kind of underpinned everything.
Yeah, but we made some like you could say mental prototypes or more like paper prototypes, but this system would work for Second World War with like divisions, and it would work with Napoleonic army, and it made sense that like if you have a certain type of like, for example, division, it doesn't have every type of unit, and it reduces a bit of the freedom, although we ultimately relaxed you could say the limitations a bit.
Scalable, you can make a retinue a full army size, and then it's so we could
but yeah, the system itself is flexible enough that like we can make one retinue per army that is like 20 units, or we could make like 2 retinue or 2 subdivision for like 10 per army.
Yeah. So again, a nice feature, nice learning into your previous question, something that we can take forward into future titles.
And yeah, but the White Tree, I think it was down to the 3 brothers and basically the whole team around Three Kingdoms that like it made sense that usually with armies it's not just a single character was coming, but it's always multiple, one of them.
Well, there you have it. A walk down memory lane, looking at one of the great Total War's Three Kingdoms. My thanks to all of you for sharing in this conversation with us and the players. I'm probably the newer member on this couch of all of you. I wasn't here for this story. So for me getting to hear that as being one of the players who love this game so much, this was a treat. So Pav, Mo, Janos, thank you very much for sharing your stories. And thank you to all of you for tuning in and listening today. Hopefully you have enjoyed it. Of course, this is just part of our 25th anniversary celebrations. And if you love Three Kingdoms, or maybe this is your first time learning more about it, why not go check the game out? It's on sale on Steam right now. Of course, if you want to see us playing it, come and hang out with us over on Twitch. We've been spending time with all of you across our communities, playing our games, learning from you, sharing even more stories. So if you want to know more about that, go and check out the links in the description. Of course, we've been filming lots of these for the different Total War games as well as part of these 25th anniversary celebrations. And if you want to see more of those, check out the playlist in the description below. But for now, we'll say our goodbyes. Thanks for watching, folks. We'll see you next time.
Thanks.
Thanks.